Now, I rarely like to produce time-sensitive videos anymore, but sometimes it's still necessary. The announcement of a moving forward of the Octarius war narrative really caught my eye because I recently discussed this here on the channel, and also it's a situation in M41 that is particularly interesting. We'll get to the summary of that in a moment, but first I figured I would just mention where this is coming from. So Games Workshop just announced a new boxed set for Kill Team, and if you don't know what Kill Team is, it's one of their adjacent games to the main Warhammer 40,000 game, like Necromunda, Titanicus and Aeronautica. It's essentially a small-scale skirmish battle system allowing you to fight with a squad as opposed to a whole army. This is appealing to many players, established, veteran and new. Well, for starters, it's a great way to get into tabletop gaming without needing to spend out for a whole army, although I should note this is not necessary even should you wish to go all in on standard 40k. Also, for established players, a game like Kill Team can enable them to dip into another faction. They maybe have not the time nor space to go all in for a new army. It can be an additional means to play with a small contingent already part of, say, an existing army. I know many who have attachments of things like Custodes, Grey Knights or Inquisition to an existing, say, Astartes force, and just for the sake of saying, no, this isn't necessarily any kind of perfect meta setup, but believe it or not, some people just enjoy building an army however they want to, and not purely just to win. The rules for Kill Team are different obviously to the primary game of 40k, but as with most Warhammer adjacent game systems, they share something of a core structure as to how they operate, meaning if you already play 40k, it's not that difficult to adapt to something like Kill Team. The same goes for Titanicus and Necromunda. Moreover, I am excessively pleased to see that they're finally doing updates for factions outside of Space Marines. Now, you all know I have a sizable Marine army, however, I also have a Sisters force in progress. My Necron army is about 80% complete. I've also got unbuilt Tyranids and Dark Eldar waiting to be cracked open. So when I say I'm pleased to see something not Marines being updated, you better believe it. The fact that this Octarius war kit starts with a sizable updating for Orks with their additional army set coming makes us dare to dream that as part of the Octarius war there may well be some Tyranid updates coming down the line, which, considering the Tyranids are meant to be this species which basically adapt to whatever war or enemy they're facing, by all rights they should be getting new models and rules every time any other faction gets an update. And I could now trawl heavily through the whole spiel and speculation about these new minis. The Orks are looking great, and anybody I know with an Ork force is quite literally foaming at the mouth right now. I hardly need to say that people who get hyped over gas mask noises are also losing it at the moment. Although caveat, Forge World removed a considerable amount of Krieg before we saw this now plastic update. So I'm wondering, are we far away from a Krieg box? The thought of it really does whet the appetite, or even that perhaps we are on the cusp of Mordian Iron Guards, New Katashan, Talan, Vostrorians, Valhallas, and so on. Basically, are we about to see the mythical Imperial Guard forces start to get updated? Yes, from time to time the Guard have had the odd bits and pieces, but essentially they haven't been updated since the second edition, which, reminder, was from 1993 to 1998. Today is a bit of a mixed bag. We're talking about the campaign stuff here, but we're also going to be discussing the Octarius war and the situation there. I'll give an overview also of the Death Corps, and when we do another video update, which will be coming soon, when we can actually get a look at that material, then we'll delve into things a little bit deeper. Now, on top of this new Kill Team update with Krieg and Orks, we also saw Games Workshop announce a new supplement campaign for Octarius, which I would note has Tyranid artwork all over it. Read into that what you will. Now, I think that campaign books are often dismissed or bypassed because they aren't seen as being fleshed enough to be considered as true lore material. I think it would be fair to say that not every campaign book hits the mark, but then what does? They aren't the Imperial Armor books, but they still have enough material to usually make them worthwhile, in my opinion. Some campaign books gift us with new material which quite simply you don't get in novels, things like the Titanicus campaign books, certainly the Necromunda supplements. I see people in the comments all the time asking me, Luton, where can I find out about ordinary humans in the Imperium? Well, as we know, it's very scarce, but most novels tend to focus on powerful characters like Astartes. Yes, there may be some subsidiary characters in there, like for example in Plague War, where we get some guardsmen, or for example in the smaller supplementary stories like Sentia, an aside that's that's a really big favourite of mine, where you see an Ultramarine accompanied by an Imperial Guardsman to the apocalyptic surface of Calth, and again there's many tales we know which have guardsmen. You get a really strong flavour in that story as well of sort of ordinary humans, albeit still, like I say, a soldier. And so yes, there's many which will include humans in novels, but a lot of the time they focus on guardsmen or inquisitors. They don't really describe the goings on of, say, hive worlds, whereas in things like the Necromunda supplements there is a very rich and quite substantial amount of detail about the living and daily goings on in the depths of a hive city. I will give a note also to Black Library having started the 40k crime series, which I was kind of excited about, and I haven't been disappointed so far. They do give a strong snapshot, more than any others I've read, about the goings on for ordinary humans. I know it can be very tempting to just get stuck in the heresy novels, especially when we've had the whole Siege of Terror series, and those are important, they do give a lot of detail, but some of these other books which are out there and other supplements which are out there give you like the whole picture, which is why I always say you need to kind of be as broad as possible if you want to really get the true perspective of 40k and the Imperium. Anyway, my point is, campaign books I often feel are seen as being just for the tabletop gameplay. This is not at all the case. I don't play tabletop that much, but I usually pick up every campaign book because it gives new information on really specific snapshots of developing situations, factions within 40k, historical events in 40k like Titanicus. And again, despite me recently having discussed this, I know that there will be many who are not at all aware of just what the Octarius War is, who is involved, what the current situation was, until we saw the possibility of now the Imperium getting more actively involved. What's interesting to me, and I hate to say that I called this, but literally only a few videos ago when I was talking about Octarius, I was saying that this was a tinderbox of a situation where the Imperium was concerned, having potentially made a bad situation delayed at best and even worse at worst. So now we see the Imperium are sending the forces, apparently, of Krieg in to try and mitigate the unravelling situation in the Octarius sector, and quite honestly this is likely one of the few Imperial Guard forces capable of handling such a nightmarish situation of Orks locking quite literal horns with the Tyranids in a war of system-wide attrition. Specifically though, what is the Octarius War and how in the hell did it get started? Well, it's both simple and very convoluted. It was roughly around 997 M41 when the Imperium began to lose contact with several systems in the Segmentum Tempestus. One Inquisitor Cryptman began the so-called Cryptman Census because having any significant sense of the status of worlds across the Imperium is difficult at the best of times, with both the challenges of time difference and reliable communications, but also the ongoing loss of contact with Imperial planets was becoming greatly troubling. Cryptman eventually made contact with every documented planet on the southern galactic region of the Imperium. What he found was a new Tyranid assault of terrifying scale. This new fleet was designated as Leviathan, and it appeared to be assaulting not across, but through the galactic plane in layman's perspective. They were attacking from below, thus they would encapsulate a massive area across the Ultima Segmentum, which would reach out into both Segmentum Tempestus and Solar. It was thought initially that the only way a Tyranid invasion of a system could be halted would be to create a planetary firebreak by exterminating the biomass of entire worlds as they became enveloped by the first stages of an assault from a Tyranid fleet, thereby making it inefficient for the Tyranids to continue on course, greatly slowing them or allowing them to become more reasonably engaged via traditional combat. This method was first employed on a truly apocalyptic scale by Inquisitor Cryptman in actions that would make him infamous when he ordered a cordon across a huge region of space, and any world that began to be engaged by the Tyranids would immediately suffer exterminatus through the use of virus bombs, destroying all life on the planet. This caused the Tyranid fleets to lose vast quantities of their biomass upon each world that they would assault. The only downside, billions of human lives were extinguished, as Cryptman believed it necessary to not evacuate these worlds for the greater good of the Imperium. The larger benefit and arguable success of Cryptman's actions remain as extremely controversial and debated topics within the Inquisition and the upper echelons of the Imperium. but it remains as one of the most costly and widespread actions of planetary slaughter the Imperium has faced since the heresy. Krippmann was left ridiculed by the Inquisition for his extreme measures, and his titles were stripped and marked for execution. Despite this, his approach did, however, slow the Tyranid fleet of Leviathan to a pace which could better be managed by the Imperials, and so to his mind, the operation was a success. However, the threat of the Tyranids and their apparent course toward Terra itself remained. Krippmann had learned much of the nature of the Tyranids at this point, and one of those being the bioform known as the Gene Stealer. He had also observed an ongoing conflict between the Orks and Tyranid on the Imperial planet of Tessa Prime, this one world which had already been evacuated ahead of High Fleet Leviathan. And because of the remaining hardware on the world, Orks began to arrive soon after, and it would then not be long that Leviathan arrived. But the Orks had been experimenting and constructing horrific weapons, presumably prior to unleashing a devastating warg on Imperial worlds. The Tyranids began to assault Tessa, and the Orks thankfully slowed their advance, allowing the Imperium time to evacuate or fortify other nearby worlds. However, what Inquisitor Krippmann learned from this encounter was that the Orks could surprisingly hold their own against the Tyranids, being able to spawn quickly enough, fight aggressively enough, to potentially, Krippmann speculated, hold the Tyranids in a position of permanent stalemate. The Tyranids themselves were able to recover continual biomass from the Orks, and so both were locked into what was a seeming unending war of attrition. Krippmann saw this as a means to prevent Leviathan from destroying the Imperium. The only question, how would he achieve this? Krippmann and an Astartes Deathwatch team managed to capture some Gene Stealers, which would be later released upon a Space Hulk. Then, by destroying a nearby moon, the gravitational shift propelled this Hulk toward the Ork Empire within, you guessed it, the Octarius sector, which, as a side note, is no small sector. It is in fact about as large as Ultramar, so massive basically. As the Space Hulk entered the Octarius Empire of the Orks, it was of course boarded by looters who were infected in short order by the Gene Stealers, and the infection began to spread within the large Ork Empire in Octarius, creating an established Tyranid presence. Krippmann had come to speculate that the Gene Stealers were essentially a Pathfinder unit for the Tyranids, and so he believed that as a result of the Gene Stealer presence in the Octarius Empire, their psychic beacons or signature would cause the bulk to change their established course and head toward the Orks. The mission achieved its objective, and the Tyranids became embroiled in what was known as the Octarius War, both Xenos trapped in an endless cycle of attrition warfare with one feeding the other. However, while this seemed like a perfect solution, Inquisitor Krippmann had overlooked one thing. What if it wasn't a perfect solution? What if one side prevailed? This is the great question of the Octarius War, with both sides numbering in such quantities. For the Imperium to actively engage them would require a scale of force not seen since the heresy, and even then it may well not be enough. And besides, it was far from certain if the Imperium could even deploy such a scale of force in the current time. Thus, the Octarius War would grind on, the outcome of which became ever more worrisome to the Imperial observers. So this new supplement for Octarius is one I am considerably interested in, and obviously when it arrives I'll be able to give more of an opinion on it. For now though, I will share some of my thoughts on this, again adapted from my previous discussion of Octarius, but remembering that these are just my logical speculations. So as I noted previously, the situation within Octarius is very obviously extremely dangerous for the Imperium, and when I spoke to Octarius originally, I considered how it could play out in several ways. Inquisitor Krippmann was reprimanded by the Inquisition for taking actions that were seemingly short-sighted, albeit also warranted at the time. Unfortunately, through his actions, he had basically kicked the can down the road and turned a very bad problem into a delayed, extremely bad problem. The plan had been to seemingly gamble that the Orks and Tyranids would whittle each other down through a battle of attrition, and eventually this would make them more manageable. Very clearly, this was quite the wishful thinking, and instead the Imperium now faces the prospect of either one of the Xenos emerging victorious and then becoming an even greater threat to the Imperium than the original Tyranid Hive Fleet was, and that was already an extremely severe threat. The only potential positive way to look upon Krippmann's plan was that given the Tyranids were on course for Terra, he had averted what would have been an unthinkable disaster, but it has left the Imperium with a problem that cannot be ignored, and although they have allowed the situation to play out for some time and keep it as contained as possible, it's fairly clear that now with this new Octarius development things are perhaps shifting, and the Imperium has realised that containment is no longer an option, or at least passive containment is no longer an option. The reasoning as to why the Imperium are now getting involved is, of course, an open question that I want to see the answers to. But I originally speculated that if the Orks were victorious but weakened, this would present the Imperium with favourable odds to launch a well-planned massive assault with both Astartes and Militarum in a campaign to crush the Orks and any remaining Tyranid, thereby reclaiming the sector for the Imperium. This was by far and away the most optimistic scenario, and my impression is that this has not happened. My other Orc speculation was that if the Orks were bolstered by victory, then the Imperium may face an entire sector of Orks embedded and grizzled with veteran combat experience, millions of Orks led by thousands of bosses leading hundreds of huge clans, all coordinated by most likely a powerful war boss who would undoubtedly keep the momentum going after crushing the Tyranids and use it as a launchpad to expand out of the Octarius sector and launch a new apocalyptic warg that could even be galactic in scale. It could spell true and complete disaster for the Imperium, and in that situation perhaps even resulting in the loss of a galactic sector or worse. The most disastrous long-term result of the Octarius War would be that, of course, the Tyranids emerge victorious and resultantly have a vast, and I feel like emphasizing that by saying it again, vast pool of biomass to work with coming out of the Octarius War. It would not be an exaggeration to say such a situation could spell the end of the Imperium and the extinction of humanity, at best within just the Ultima Segmentum, at worst potentially the entire galaxy. Still, while plausible, that does seem quite apocalyptic, and if I take my lore immersion hat off, the most likely scenario facing Octarius, and the one which I expect we will see playing out in the Octarius book, is both Orks and Tyranids remaining locked in an ongoing conflict, and the Imperium understanding the dangers in either of the Xenos emerging victorious have now decided that they must step in to more proactively manage the situation with the ultimate goal of containment. I don't see it being likely that the Imperium has the forces available to lead a crusade to obliterate the Orks and Tyranids in Octarius, because if they had that, then Krypton wouldn't have had to enact this mad plan from the outset, and this whole situation would have been avoided. However, as we have recently learned through this Kill Team box, the forces of Krieg have entered the fray. And I will say it's noteworthy that both the Forge world of Ryza and the planet of Katashan are both considerably closer to Octarius than Krieg is. Now, arguably this is irrelevant because distance is not really a measurable thing when travelling through the warp, so it could in fact take an equal subjective amount of time to travel from Ryza to Octarius as it does, say, from Krieg, or perhaps even less time. But the point is that there are other worlds that are in a galactic proximity closer to Octarius, and that could both send considerable firepower and expertise to Octarius. This is not to say that Krieg are unsuited to such a situation, but I did think it was worth mentioning, if for no other reason than potentially future collaboration later down the line. I have to say, the thought of Krieg and Katashan Guard teaming up to fight Orks and Tyranids, backed by Titans and Knights from Ryza, it is making me salivate quite considerably, and I think we could easily imagine this could make for some truly epic tabletop games if you had friends with the appropriate forces to make up a gigantic 5-player board. I'll just let you imagine that for a moment, because it would be such an epic thing to see. Lastly, I will just make a mention that it was previously believed that around Octarius, the Eldar also had seen how absurd the situation was becoming, and they were reportedly raising Imperial and Orc worlds in an attempt to starve and diminish the Tyranids. Chaos were also involved to a degree, and it was reported that traitor Marines of the World Eaters were enjoying the Festival of Slaughter and were gathering skulls for the Blood God. As I've noted before, often people will say, what, World Eaters fighting Xenos? How is that very Khorne? Well, it's important to remember that Khorne's worship does not require necessarily human souls, nor temples or offerings to appease it. Khorne's worship is made purely by engaging in slaughter on the battlefield, be that bloodshed of any species. It's about actions, not words. Looking at you, Tzeentch. Most importantly, it can come from both literal victory or by the gauntlet of one's own suffering. Worshippers of Khorne tell that allowing even a single day to pass without engaging in bloodshed would incur Khorne's displeasure, and within the Octarius sector, the traitors of the 12th Legion had stumbled upon a perfect crucible of unending slaughter. So, as I was just saying, one might ask the question, why would the Imperium send Imperial Guard from the planet of Krieg to engage in Octarius? I think the very obvious answer for those who already have some knowledge about the Guard forces who hail from the world of Krieg is that they're able to withstand engagements that you might define as being wars of attrition better than others. Krieg are well known for their ability to weather campaigns which become heavily embedded and result in engagements that are very much wars of material firepower, where the soldiers become little more than a disposable resource. I know that often this is how it appears the Imperium thinks of all of its military forces, but in terms of Krieg, think of that but carried to its most extreme form, and then you have the Death Korps of Krieg. Importantly though, these kind of engagements normally would crush the spirits of ordinary humans over time. There's only so much that even the most loyal servants of the Imperium can endure. For all of the glory and death seen upon the world of Cadia, they hardly had to endure for months or years. Krieg are the masters of attrition. Their ability to weather suffering is near unrivaled, to a point it becomes considerably morbid, and other serving Imperials, when having fought alongside the Death Korps of Krieg, are said to have found it disturbing how casually they will expend their lives, to a point where sometimes it can have a negative impact on those serving alongside, so depressing is the loss of life, and it has been known to be necessary that commissars hold back the Krieg from throwing themselves so willfully at the enemy or engaging in acts that amount to a truly depressing waste of human life in the eyes of other Imperial Guard. But I do think it's worthwhile that I outline in brief why the Death Korps display these characteristics. But yes, for those of you who have asked me endlessly, I will undoubtedly look to create a singular video about Krieg somewhere along the line. With this release, that might now come sooner than later. But just to say again, this today is a brief overview of the Death Korps. So Krieg Guardsmen hail from the death world of, you guessed it, Krieg. And Krieg is an irradiated planet. Its entire surface is a nuclear wasteland. Its cities are now nothing more than rubble and ash. Its atmosphere highly toxic. This all came about because, not entirely dissimilarly to the world of Rofanon, a growing resentment of the Imperial Administratum would create a schism in the ruling council, and this fracture escalated into an all-out civil war against loyalists for the Imperium, with the others standing against them. I should note, this was not a situation where worship or corruption of chaos was believed to have been a trigger or influence. These were merely human civil affairs, as happens on some Imperial planets. Again, I reference Rofanon as another example, albeit very different circumstances. The loyalists on Krieg were unfortunately grossly outnumbered, yet they refused to relinquish the world to the traitors who had turned against the Emperor. Colonel Yerton, commander of the loyalist forces of Krieg, made the unfortunate decision that if they were unable to achieve victory by traditional combat, which seemed impossible, then he would deny the planet to the traitors by any means necessary, and this meant unleashing nuclear annihilation upon their entire planet. Nuclear weapons, it should be noted, are very much still used by the Imperium in the 41st millennium, but being still just as devastating as they were when they were originally conceived in the unknowable history of ancient humanity, they are usually kept locked down heavily by the Mechanicus, only to be used in the most severe combat engagements. So it's kind of comical that even in the Imperium, nuclear weapons are seen as being ridiculously dangerous. But they will still be used in situations such as the rebellion upon Krieg. The nuclear annihilation unleashed by Colonel Yerton left the world an irradiated wasteland. On Krieg, this became known as the Purging, and it was at this point that the Imperium no longer saw Krieg as worth saving. It was effectively a dead world now, and so the Imperium would not deploy any reinforcements to aid the loyalists, no guard, no Astartes. They were left to fight for themselves, and the outcome would determine what the result would be: acceptance in some form back into the Imperium, or likely a final act of annihilation to scour any remaining traitors from the planet. For the people of Krieg, after this act of extreme destruction, the war did not end, regardless of whether the Imperium had walked away. The ordinary humans of Krieg continued to fight on, but in a much more bleak fashion. It became a now grueling war of attrition between the loyalists and traitors. And because of the environment above the surface, the distances between hive cities became littered with vast expanses of trench networks. The ground was covered in wire, and artillery bombarded the enemy day and night. Sometimes even additional atomics were still used. The war fought over this nuclear wasteland raged for some 15 generations. It was roughly half a millennia, and for all the generations since, they were to be brought up into a world with no sky above them, only darkness, death, an industrial-scale warfare. The only place the citizens of Krieg could exist was below the surface, and despite these extremely harsh living conditions, not to mention the 500 years of grinding attrition on the surface, every member of their Death Corps now would continue to fight with unrelenting determination, regularly hand-to-hand with bayonet and shovel, over mere meters of trenches, fighting in the darkness of the tunnels, or over the wastelands through the blood and mud and horror. The atmosphere so toxic that their masks could never be removed above ground, only able to fight for limited periods amid the highly irradiated toxic ground, an environment that were truly that of human nightmares. The situation upon Krieg stands as a bleak testament to the extremes of the human condition. Krieg would not return to the Imperium until the late period of M40, and by then the opinion of what had occurred upon Krieg was unsurprisingly not seen in a positive light. So there was no celebration for Krieg when it returned to the Imperium, successfully having destroyed the traitors. Instead, they were issued with a cold demand that they were now behind on paying their Imperial tithe. The planet of Krieg now was heavily in debt to the wider Imperium. As with the majority of Imperial hive worlds such as Krieg, that tithe were to be paid in guardsmen. However, the Munitorum were shocked when Krieg would offer 20 whole regiments for the Imperium and requested the most severe of environments for them to be deployed within. Now, I should also say this is not unheard of in other situations. Similarly, there was the situation on the planet of Vostroya. During the Heresy, Vostroya refused to provide soldiers and materials to either side of that conflict. Extremely bizarrely, they had determined their best bet was to remain neutral and productive during the Heresy. Very obviously, in the aftermath, this was not viewed positively. So Vostroya would make a declaration to the Imperium, likely to prevent it being punished even more severely, that every firstborn child of the world would be sworn to the Imperium's service. A long time has passed since then, but for the people of Vostroya, although not all are aware of the details, all know that when the Emperor needed them, they turned away. And this deep shame means that ever since that time they commit even now their firstborn to forever fight and scrub clean the stain of shame that remains upon their world, and in the light of the Imperium always will. The point is that like Vostroya, Krieg needed to show the Imperium that it would make up for their embarrassing situation and the sheer scale of waste that had occurred upon a previously stable and productive Imperial planet. The quantity of guard made available to the Imperium became attributed to the fact that over 500 years, the original loyalists had managed to expand their bunkers below the surface into huge underground cities, now capable of supporting a significant civilian population. They had also maintained the industry they knew, and so had stockpiled materials and warfare production. The new Death Corps Guard were seen as being extremely effective in harsh combat environments, far more so than the standard Imperial Guard, and so the Munitorum would apply the maximum tithe grade to Krieg, as the new Death Corps units were so effective. This is now Krieg's sole focus for the Imperium, to produce Death Corps in the greatest quantities possible, and as efficiently as possible. The senior leadership of the Imperium tasked Krieg essentially to make available to them as many Death Corps as was possible and by any means necessary. This is where the dark rumours about advanced growth and production of new soldiers have originated, leading to speculation that the population of Krieg have, in collaboration with their Mechanicus representatives, engaged in frowned upon or even forbidden practices, perhaps involving cloning or advanced human production such as artificial wombs within industrial birthing factorum. Perhaps combined with some means of rapidly increasing growth to maturity. Unlocked beneath the surface of Krieg, there is little official material to speak to, but it is believed that they engage in the use of these so-called vitae wombs, which are barely used outside of the Adeptus biologists, and many within the wider Imperium, but especially the Mechanicus biologists, see these as abhorrent, borderline heretical. Where an ordinary hive city may raise only one Imperial Guard regiment when the tithe is due, Krieg are readily able to raise as many as 10. Such is the high amount of output. So this is why the Death Corps of Krieg are deployed to such harsh environments. However, it is not simply the quantity of troops available or the unrelenting ferocity with which these troops engage in environments that others would struggle to maintain morale against. The sheer volume of guardsmen makes Krieg the obvious forces to send into a war which has engulfed an entire sector of territory and is being fought between some of the most horrifying Xenos in the galaxy, the Orks and the Tyranid. The very simple answer as to the question why Krieg, it's simple. They're the most expendable forces weighed against their ability to withstand the physical and psychological conditions of such a war, combined with their ability to weather bleak attrition. All Imperial Guardsmen are ultimately, of course, expendable in the eyes of the Imperium. Wars are fought by the Imperium in terms of sheer weight of souls. They will think little of the slaughter of millions if it can secure victory. Humans are highly replaceable in the 41st millennium, and these are merely numbers on some administratum scribe's data slate. But the Death Korps of Krieg offer the most effective force for the severity of the situation. This is further bolstered by the fact that Krieg fighters are exposed to high rates of punishment and fatality almost as their training begins, which for many will be the very early stages of their lives. Fear, weakness of any kind are not tolerated at all, neither are any mutations. Like all training within the Imperium, it is of course harsh and unrelenting, both mentally and physically, but for Krieg, they are pushed so far that they either will suffer a full unrecoverable mental breakdown, at which point they would likely be executed as a failed soldier, or they will physically perish during the highly unforgiving training. I know compared to many descriptions of training in the Imperium, this sounds almost commonplace or default, but not all Imperial Guard training is quite as insane and severe as that of the Death Korps. Most Guard are strict, grueling and severe in their training, but for Death World Imperial Guard, and especially upon Krieg, they push their recruits way past the point of endurance that most other Imperial worlds would. So with that in mind, it's perhaps as well it occurs out of the sight of the wider Imperium, because training to be a Death Korps Guardsman is again a fairly depressing affair. There are no celebrations or bluster of tradition and ceremony. It is a practical, cold, emotionless production line for producing human war machines that never ends day or night. Their final test is to venture, of course, onto the surface of Krieg, where they will be worked similarly hard, but in the apocalyptic conditions of the nuclear wasteland, clearing minefields, removing miles of wire, mock battles, long marches, and no clemency for any who allow themselves to become severely injured or fall behind. The final reason for why the Imperium would choose to deploy the Death Korps of Krieg to Octarius is their general outlook and psychology of the Death Korps of Krieg. It's often said that the Krieg are near enough suicidal that they will throw their lives away as if they were nothing. This is only partly accurate. It's certainly true that the Corps will throw themselves at any situation as is warranted. They will not back down or relent, certainly not exhibiting fear or any lack of mental fortitude in the face of whatever it is they're tasked with accomplishing, certainly no matter how horrific. But no, they're not suicidal, but they will certainly take on missions an ordinary guardsman may describe as such, because in the eyes of the Death Korps, they fight at the behest of the Emperor, and you say all Imperial Guard do this. This is true, but no matter the task, no matter the scale of difficulty, the Death Korps of Krieg will follow their orders under any circumstances. Does this mean they fight every engagement by simply running all units headlong into the enemy? No, this would generally be tactically stupid, although there are many times where that will happen with the Death Korps. But the key thing to remember is that they fight for victory and the Imperium and of course the Emperor, but not to just die as quickly as possible. The Krieg do have a reputation as well for a morose attitude. They're generally unwilling to compromise or surrender. They certainly will fight without little, if any, apparent regard for their lives, and this has thus given them this reputation of being suicidal to other Imperial Guard regiments. And I would suggest this is due to the environment and the indoctrination they were brought up within on Krieg, that the Death Korps see themselves as infinitely replaceable and anonymous. This is only further reinforced by their use of rebreathers, which upon Krieg they will have worn extensively, and so to other Guard they appear somewhat terrifying themselves, as they rarely will ever remove these in a combat situation or a campaign. And the level of self-sacrifice exhibited by the Death Korps, as noted, can be problematic for other Guard regiments, who find it demoralizing to see how the Krieg forces will allow themselves to be slaughtered in such high numbers to achieve what other Imperial Guard may see as minimal objectives. There are also questions one might ask about the state of mind of Krieg forces given their rapid upbringing. Their sullen nature might well be attributed to the lack of emotional human development that is the norm elsewhere, but for the rapidly trained and deployed Guardsmen of Krieg, this is very likely scarce, and they are deployed off-world before such things have any chance to be reinforced. I would myself even speculate that it's possible that the Death Korps are possibly limited in some ways by the means that they're brought into the world, and we have no way of knowing how this affects them psychologically, combined with also the harshness of their training and the immediacy of it. However, it is precisely this psychology as to why the Death Korps are ideal to send into the Octarius sector. This theatre of combat will be extreme in every aspect, and the type of enemies they will encounter, the weapons they will have to face, the undoubtedly astronomically high quantity of guardsmen who will die fighting the Xenos horrors. The specific purpose of the Death Korps in Octarius remains to be seen, but one thing's for sure, the nature of the warfare will be that of grinding attrition, likely, in my opinion, to contain the war and perhaps ultimately hope to bring it back into some more stable state, or at least prevent it from spilling out into the wider Imperium. And few other forces would be able to face the horror that the Krieg Guard will have to in Octarius. The Tyranids with their appalling bioweapons, which just the sight of their effect can be extremely psychologically damaging to ordinary guard, or the Orks with their unending grinding battles, which seemingly never end and only get stronger and more aggressive with each passing day. It's very possible that the Death Korps of Krieg will become the only thing which stands between Octarius and the outbreak of an unstoppable Xenos campaign that risks consuming the Imperium itself. As I said in the beginning, although some of these supplement books are not always received with massive hype from tabletop players, for people like myself who are interested primarily in the lore and the fleshing out of these tight, focused scenarios occurring throughout the galaxy, granted, they often only have a section on the expanding narrative. It's not a massive novel of 400 pages, but there is one key difference, which is that novels tend to be by and large quite character driven, and they're focused on the development of characters and events, but the events are generally providing the backdrop to them. Supplement material tends to often focus heavily on the events and the environment occurring. This is not to say that it doesn't make mention of specific individuals, but what it does tend to do is it cuts out most conversation and gets down to the heartwood of the raw sequence of events and what actions are taken by specific sides. All of this will then be fleshed out with other details and placed into context. And this is generally what I would expect from most campaign books. It's why I own most of them, from the 8th and the 9th, the entire Imperial Armor book set, the Heresy campaign books, the Titanicus set of books, Sabbat Worlds. This stuff lays out critically important events in fantastic detail and are, in my opinion, essential companions to things like the Heresy novel series, or the ongoing situation in relation to the Great Rift, the Prior Nexus, and so on. Anyway, my point is campaign books, they're not just for tabletop players, they provide great background material that you may not find elsewhere. And of course today we're talking about Octarius, and that's why I'm excited, because I'm looking forward to Octarius being fleshed out and us finding about what is happening now within that system, that conflict. But I'll simply finish by saying I very rarely get hyped for things. It takes a specifically narrow focus to make me feel excited about any release. But this Octarius book has really captured my attention. I didn't expect it. I thought they were going to keep hammering away at Guilliman's Crusade, and this has been a wild surprise. I'm not expecting some 300-page tome. Judging by what most campaign books have been recently, I have a good idea about the amount of lore that's going to be in there. But for somebody like me, that's more than enough to pique my interest. Would I like a heavier book? Hell yes, but I'll take what I can get at this point. But just generally, if you're interested in the lore, if you're interested in the world of 40k, I do recommend that people expand what they read outside of the novels. Look at stuff like campaign books, codexes. Codexes have a lot of detail in there as well. You can still get some of the Heresy campaign books, Imperial Armor stuff you can get out there as well. For me though, Octarius is this significantly interesting situation, and it is arguably more actively dangerous to the stability of the Imperium than the Great Rift at this moment in time, the key word there being arguably. But I couldn't think of a better way to outro this situation today than when I discussed it before. So simply say, if Octarius goes wrong for the Imperium and they are unable to contain the horrifying Xenos within, then yes, humanity will be facing catastrophic consequences.